cycle is that the negotiations after 2 weeks ago, where there was a breakup in the negotiations, they have now resumed. We have had two intensified negotiations sessions, one in London and one most recently in Brussels, which concluded yesterday. They have changed the scope of these negotiations, intensified them. There is a commitment to work over the weekend. The chief negotiators are meeting on a daily basis. The joint secretariat has been set up. And most crucially, they are negotiating parallel on all elements of the agreement and starting to exchange legal texts. I think these are all very positive developments. However, the negotiations are currently on hold again, pending resumption in London, either over this weekend or early part of next week. There still are large divergences between the two positions, and most notably on the level playing fields, and more specifically on what the UK subsidies regime is likely to look at, and of course around fish, still a hugely political issue and will remain a political issue right up until the end of the negotiations, I suspect. I think that there is a pathway to a deal. Compromise will be needed on both sides. Both the EU and the UK have taken maximalist positions in some areas. It seems as though they are getting close together. And what has been particularly different in this most intensified phase of the negotiations is there have been very little information coming out of it other than the statements yesterday at the end of the current phase. Many of the journalists here in Brussels are scraping around, looking for stories, phoning people. Most notably Tony Connolly, for those Brexit watchers, who's been particularly on the front foot in terms of information on the negotiations. He himself has been phoning around, and the story in Brussels is, if Tony doesn't know what's happening, there's probably very few people in Brussels who do. Now that's a positive sign, because that means that the negotiations are in a tight lockdown, which means that the compromises are being discussed. When it goes quiet here, it's actually a reasonably positive sign. But I think we are going to have to wait for a little bit before we see a deal. We were thinking that a deal might be in place at some point over the middle of November. I think that might now be pushed back. We have to be quite conscious of the fact that the time is running tight on ratification of this deal. And I think going through the questions that we're going to look at later on, both the poll questions and the update on the checklist of actions for companies to take, there is going to be disruption at the end of the year. Things are going to change fundamentally. And one of the most important messages is to be as prepared for that as you can. It's not clear that even if a deal is agreed in the coming weeks, that the entire legal ratification process will be able to be done by the 31st of December. So there is possibility of greater uncertainty between now and the end of the year. And we also are very conscious of the fact that this is about a two-way relationship. The state for GB will be different from the state for Northern Ireland potentially at the end of this, and you will have different measures in terms of the EU market. So looking at it from a UK perspective, a UK business perspective, you will need to understand your commitments to the GB market, which are changing, your commitments potentially to Northern Ireland market, which are changing, and your commitments to the EU market. A lot of guidance has been published, and colleagues from BEIS who have highlighted that. It will continue to be made clear that as it stands at the moment, there isn't the level of certainty that businesses will need to plan for all eventualities. And one of the core messages will be about preparing yourself to be unprepared in some areas. I'll head on to the poll, and if I could ask Chris just to run that poll, we can talk through the results, and then I'll run through some of the issues which we're suggesting. I think that poll's gone live for everyone. just running through the questions on the poll. We're asking to what extent companies have changed their preparations. So at the last round of RABs, we asked about how prepared companies were, and we're just trying to get a gauge of whether things have changed in the last few months since that update. Looking at how COVID-19 is impacting those preparations, and I think specifically now with the change in situation with the additional lockdown, that's clearly going to have an impact on companies. Particularly then we have a couple of questions around processing for the end of the year at the border. So looking at whether you've sourced external support for customs declarations, whether you engaged an agent or a freight forwarding organisation, or whether you're looking at doing that in-house. And then the final question is about the staged introduction of the UK customs or border model. So the UK has announced that that will be phased in over 3 phases. The first of those starting on January the 1st, the second on April the 1st, and finally the full implementation of the new UK border model on the 1st of July next year. Thanks, Chris. I think Chris has just finished that poll. So I'll just run through some of the results of the poll. So it does seem as though there has been a trend towards some increase in preparations since the last time we spoke. The majority are the same. It's quite an interesting, we had it, but as we saw before, companies are preparing for the end of the year. I think we had probably anticipated this one, but we wanted to get your feeling on what was actually happening on the ground. That clearly the ongoing COVID-19 disruptions are still having a significant impact in the capability and the ability of companies to prepare for the end of the year. On the third question, looking at the advice here, there is new advice coming out from HMRC, from HMG on the new border model and customs declarations. That is tending to favour companies looking at external partners and looking at customs agents or freight forwarders to do that. So it's interesting that some have, but the majority of people haven't, and that isn't necessarily an issue, but it's one which we are recommending companies to have the conversation with their logistics companies, with their freight forwarders, with agents, and if that's an area where they can help. And finally, not aware of the phased stages of the new UK border model. I think we have guidance on that, and that's one of the areas which we'll cover in the presentation going forward. But there is additional guidance on the QA website. We anticipated that there might be a challenge in understanding that in its entirety. Chair, I will quickly pause there before I go on to the next phase, next part of the presentation, and just see if there are any questions from anyone on the update of the negotiations, on what happens next, and then any of the polling questions. And then I'll run through, as timely as possible, some of the questions we're suggesting companies to ask themselves.
Okay, thanks, Fergus. Any questions then? Right, you're doing such a good job, Fergus. I got no questions.
Right, I'll get back to the presentation. Just bear with me a second and get my screen back up. Okay. So as I mentioned, looking at questions to ask yourselves before the end of the year, before the end of the transition period, and split into 3 main areas: trade in goods, regulation, company law and business obligations, and then people. Taking those in order, Part of the issue around trade in goods is understanding that the UK will leave the single market and customs union, and therefore the relationship in terms of placing goods on the EU market will fundamentally change at the end of this year. As I mentioned at the top, there are also additional responsibilities or obligations on placing goods on the GB market, and they may be, in many instances, different from the obligations to place goods on the Northern Ireland market as well. So understanding your relationship UK to EU, EU to UK, and GB to NI are going to be quite important. There are also going to be border formalities. That is a inevitable consequence of the decision for the UK to leave the single market and customs union. So even in the event of a deal, there will be border formalities and declarations, checks and controls, which take place at the border. There are still part of the discussion. There is a hope that there will be bilateral recognition of content in the future FTA. It is not clear at this stage whether there'll be accumulation, but understanding what your obligations are on rules of origin will be quite key. And then some additional trade issues around VAT and excise duty and REACH as well. So looking at questions in terms of your obligations for importers and exporters, really looking here at understanding the obligations which you will have, making sure that you're registered for the Economic Operator Registration and Identification System, the EORI number, understanding that you know what your commodity codes are for the goods. This can be quite a complex exercise, but many who are already exporting outside the EU will be well aware of this. But for those who have only ever traded with the EU, it might be more of a challenge. Understanding how you correctly calculate the value of your goods for declarations. Just to preempt part of this, although there is a phased introduction of your responsibilities for submitting paperwork in the new border model, actually you will have to do the calculations and have the paperwork in case there are any spot checks. And reviewing your delivery terms, so Incoterms, a part of your contractual relationship, and understanding whether these need to be reviewed going forward. Looking at the border itself, understanding the formalities, and again, there are different formalities depending on which border you cross. So understanding the formalities coming into the EU market, coming into the UK market, going out in both instances, and again across the Irish Sea with the GB-NI relationship, and understanding whether you are familiar with any of those responsibilities. Understanding how you're going to do a declaration. So this draws on to that third question in the poll. Are you looking at an external company to do that, or are you looking at in-house expertise? How will you make that declaration? Will you use any of the infrastructures which are currently available? Looking at special and simplified procedures on offer. So looking at some of the trusted trader schemes, but also the wider easement mechanisms which HMRC have introduced, and are you using those? Really looking at the possibility of longer timeframes resulting from the formalities. So understanding, are your supply chains resilient to any potential delay, and recognizing that even in the event that you have everything correctly formulated, it's quite possible that your shipment or your trade might be held up by someone in the queue in front of you who hasn't done that. So just recognizing that that's one of those areas where preparing to be unprepared is going to be essential. And then understanding the new UK border model, as I said, the 3 phases of introductions of customs formalities from January of next year. Looking at that in very high level detail, there are requirements from the 1st of January. Import declarations are required on all imports from the EU, but these can be deferred for up to 6 months in certain circumstances. And then exported goods from GB to the EU required to complete a UK customs declaration customs export declaration. And again, these can be deferred up to 4 weeks if a simplified declaration is made up front. So that's the first instance of a bit of easement at the UK side, but, and a heavy but here, it is unlikely at this stage, or unknown, but certainly not any information that we've had, that there will be easement on the EU side. So your full responsibilities will likely be applied at the EU border on the EU side from the 1st of January. There are 2 additional phases, further information on those on the Make UK website. Looking at rules of origins and tariffs, understanding the relevant procedures and documentations supporting the status of your goods. As I said, many companies will be aware of this, but for some companies this will be a new exercise. Looking at supplier declarations and understanding whether you have any responsibilities throughout your value chain from suppliers or customers, and then familiarising yourself with UK Global Tariff Schedule. Many of the pieces of advice on rules of origin and on the UK global tariff can be found in the Make UK Brexit toolkit. We don't, if there is a deal, anticipate there being tariffs, but I think we do have to highlight that a deal hasn't been agreed yet, and if the event that no deal is agreed at the end of this year, from the 1st of January, there will be tariffs payable inbound to the UK and inbound into the EU. So understanding that tariff exposure is going to be important. Looking at additional trade requirements. So are you ready for the changes in VAT rules? So VAT being payable on import into the UK, and likewise your responsibilities in the EU on inbound into the EU market. Looking at your regulations that should apply to your products, understanding whether new product approval processes will be needed. There are some additional guidance on the UK conformity assessment mark, the EU CE marking, particularly into the EU market. If you have a requirement to have that marking registered, are you registered with an EU competent authority? That's essential going inbound into the EU market. There is some easement again on the UK side, but no easement on the EU side. And understanding your responsibility to REACH systems at the end of this year, an EU REACH system and a UK REACH system, understanding your responsibilities under those, as potentially you transfer from being a distributor, manufacturer, to being an importer in some instances. Looking at company law and business obligations. So UK and EU registered companies, whether you yourself are or you have subsidiaries that are, understanding, can you continue to operate in the EU? Are there legal requirements in terms of central administration and principal place of business? This is particularly important in the area of service provision, but more widely understanding your company structure. There may well be responsibilities in terms of EU nationals acting as directors of companies, and you'll certainly have a responsibility as an importer into the EU in some areas of EU legislation to have a authorised person to operate on your behalf. Looking at contracts and understanding the choice of jurisdiction in your contracts. Again, this is particularly important and pertinent to a no-deal exit where there isn't an agreement on civil justice cooperation. There is hope that in the agreement there would be, but as it stands at the moment, something to look at. Intellectual property and data, 2 particularly complicated areas, and just recognising whether you've taken the necessary steps to protect your IP in the EU market, whether you have done the same in the UK market, and understanding whether you are familiar with your obligations under transfer of personal data. Again, particularly important in the event of no deal. There is a hope that the UK will be have a equivalent recognition from the EU, but it's quite possible at the end of this year that that won't have been completed, even in the event of a deal. So your responsibilities there in terms of, so understanding if your company provides services in the EU, do you have the right licenses to operate? Do you have the right of establishment in order to do so? And looking at whether you have mutual recognition of professional qualifications. Anyone who has exercised their mutual recognition of their professional qualification before the end of this year should be protected under the withdrawal agreement, but that doesn't count for anyone who hasn't had that recognised. Just to give you an example of that, were you a qualified engineer under a UK system and you had worked in another EU member state before the end of this year under that qualification, which has then been recognised by the state in which you worked, that would have been exercised. Simply having the UK qualification doesn't exercise it. You will have had to have had it exercised. So that's an important distinction, but understanding some of the limitations there is going to be important. Looking at people, this is really about understanding your responsibilities to EU nationals working in your company in the UK. Lots of advice that we provided over recent years on that, but again, we do have further advice. And then understanding your responsibilities of sending people into the EU, be that for short-term business trips or for the provision of services, and understanding that there are rule changes which happened this year, which the UK needs to be compliant with, or companies in the UK need to be compliant with, but also that there is likely to be disruption in this area going forward, and understanding what your exposure is, how often you send people to the EU, and what they do when they're there. It is possible that in this area there could be an agreement with the EU which makes that process easier, but it is still likely to be not as simple as it is today. In the event of no deal, it's likely you will have 27 different regimes to be familiar with, because immigration or processing of third country nationals is not an EU competence, it's a member state competence. So unless there's agreement that supersedes that, that could be quite a complex one, understanding what work is and how that is defined, and your visa and work permit responsibilities. As I've said, we have quite a bit of advice and services which we have available to members. We are updating that on a regular basis. One of the processes which we will be completing over the course of the next week or so is to convert that list of questions, which I've just run through rather quickly, into a checklist for companies with a slight additional information and links to relevant government and relevant EU guidance on that. So we will be producing a checklist, and we'll have that both for email to members, but also up on the website. There is the hub itself, which provides constantly updated data and links to the UK government support services, as well as the EU Commission guidance. We have the Brexit toolkit, as I said, particularly relevant if you're looking at tariff exposures, but there is all workforce, and looking more broadly on EU business travel. We have a consultancy service, but the first 30-minute consultation is free to members. And then there is an extensive suite of export training courses, from training on customs and customs formalities right through to rules of origin, have just gone live, which will be enable you to go through all of the steps that you need to take in terms of your export responsibilities. Again, I'll pause there for a moment, and if there are any questions on that before I come on to the